Turn with me to page 126 in the Business Ethics in Action text. We're going to do a grab bag of several issues in management ethics today, starting with the issue of bribery. So this Siemens case here on page 127, Siemens is a very large industrial giant in the EU, headquartered in Germany, historic company. They have some presence over here in the United States, but largely they're a European company. And they got busted for these offshore slush funds where they diverted hundreds of millions of dollars to pay off government officials in developing world countries so that they could receive government contracts. Okay, and the EU has laws against corruption, even if the corruption is only in another country, as long as the company that is involved in the corruption is domiciled in the EU, it is susceptible to prosecution. Okay, and it ended up being bad for Siemens in terms of lost investor confidence and lost business, and also in terms of the fines that they had to pay. They had to pay substantial fines. But this kind of a practice, although Siemens is a pretty high-profile case, is pretty widespread. It's something that occurs a lot, actually. And in fact, there are parts of the world where the reality is you cannot do business without bribery. Okay, think about that with me for just a second. There are parts of the world where you must pay a bribe or a facilitation payment at the very least in order to be able to get the contract or in order to be able to do business at all. And this raises some very interesting questions. First of all, I thought that it might be useful to think a little bit about the morality of bribery before talking a little bit, so we'll do that in some depth, before talking a little bit about what can be done about it. Okay, so first of all, I want to ask you guys a question. The empirical reality is definitely that bribery occurs with regularity in lots of parts of the world. So if it is so common, why do we have the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act in the United States, which makes it illegal for American companies to give or receive bribes regardless of where they are doing business in the world? If they are domiciled in the United States, then it is illegal for them to do so. Why does the EU have such strict anti-bribery laws? What is really wrong with bribery? Where is the wrongness in bribery? What is the moral force or valence of it? Where is the wrongness? Where is it located? The opportunity for corruption, thank you. That's a good starting point. What does that mean? Okay, can change the goal of what the company is there to do. Good. I think it can certainly do that. What else can it change? Anybody can answer. Changes the mind of the government official, doesn't it? Right? Changes that. Okay, one of the arguments against bribery is the unfairness argument. Bribery is unfair, morally speaking, because it creates unequal business playing fields. Let's think about that together. If the company that gets the contract is the one that pays off the government official, it might not necessarily be the company that on the merits of their proposal should have gotten the contract. In fact, the company that might be much more efficient or have much better a much better reputation for good products or for trustworthy manufacturing might not have received the contract at all. Instead, it might have gone to some other much less worthy company. Unfairness was created in the business climate. Or if a company is able to dump toxic wastes because they pay off a regulator, and so the regulator looks the other way. But the other companies in the same business setting, not paying off the regulator, don't have that luxury. Again, unfairness is created in the business climate, usually because in almost all cases, the cheapest thing to do is the environmentally damaging thing. The dumping of the toxic waste is almost always cheaper than cleaning up the toxic waste before discarding it. So one problem with bribery is unfairness. What's another problem with bribery? Where's the moral wrongness there? This is if you think about ethics, it might be useful to imagine it in terms of agents engaging in actions with certain kinds of consequences. Agents do actions with certain consequences. Some ethicists say that the most important thing that we should focus on when thinking about ethics is the action itself, whether the action is done in accordance with right principles. If it's done in accordance with right principle, then it's justified. For instance, the principle, don't take innocent human life. If an action takes innocent human life, it violates that principle, then regardless, on these ethicists' view of things, regardless of the consequences that come about, it's still a wrong action. Other ethicists focus on the consequences and say the most important thing when it comes to assessing the moral valence of actions is what outcomes result from the actions. If those outcomes are good outcomes, then, for these ethicists at least, it justifies the action, even if the action might be ethically questionable. Still, if the results are good, then it is sufficient to justify the action in question. Okay, these are consequentialists who endorse that view. Still, other ethicists point to agents and say, what matters most in assessing the moral worth of actions is the character states of agents, the intentions of agents. If the agent engaged in the action intends wrongdoing, then it doesn't matter if good consequences result. Still, the agent's character was corrupted. And so the action itself is unjustifiable. Okay, now, this reason for the wrongness of bribery, unfairness, is not a function of the consequences, because it's a wrong that adheres regardless of the consequences. Instead, it is a reason that is localized in the actions and especially in the principles by means of which the actions take place. Part of the wrongness of bribery is that it creates unfairness between and among agents in the business climate. And we could posit a principle: business is best and transactions among parties are best when they are fair and when all parties know that they are fair. But there are other reasons too that can be referenced, reasons that have to do with the consequences of actions. Okay, try this one on for size. Bribery leads to poverty. Bribery leads to poverty. That's one of the reasons why bribery is wrong. Let me read you guys a list of the most corrupt countries in the world. Countries where giving and receiving bribes is done at a higher rate than in any other country, any of the other countries in the world. Here's the list. North Korea, Afghanistan, Somalia, Venezuela, Colombia, Liberia, Congo. What do these countries have in common? They're countries from very diverse parts of the world, aren't they? They're all poor. These are the poorest countries in the world. Venezuela, poorest country in the Western Hemisphere. I think Haiti might be, actually, but Venezuela's really close. It's not a 1-to-1 ratio of the most corrupt to the poorest, but it's pretty close. Okay, the most prosperous countries have the least corruption, the fewest bribes, although bribery takes place in all countries. And the least prosperous countries, the most impoverished countries, have the greatest corruption and the most bribes. Bribery leads to poverty. So what seems to be the case is that where there is corruption, there also you will find poverty. This is, by the way, a consequentialist reason why bribery is wrong. Think with me for a second. How might bribery lead to poverty? What's the causal relationship there? What's the factor that brings about poverty, or factors, as a result of bribery? Good. One of the reasons why bribery leads to poverty is definitely that it localizes wealth in the hands of governing elites, rather than dispersing wealth more generally among the society in ways that can benefit everybody. Okay, so localizes wealth. Another reason also why bribery leads to poverty is one that we've already alluded to some extent in the lecture, and that is that bribery undermines efficiency. Okay, the company that gets the contract is not the one that has the best merits. It's not the one that is most likely to do the most trustworthy job or offer the most reliable product. Rather, it is the company that makes the bribe, that does the bribe. Okay, so it damages efficiency. And efficiency gains are one of the main reasons why the world's most prosperous countries are the most prosperous countries. Because they have found ways to do things in efficient, reliable, and successful ways, successful manners. When bribery undermines efficiency, it ensures poverty, because lots of social resources are deployed for inefficient reasons. I gotta spell that right. Okay, bribery and poverty. The relationship is actually not a one-way street. This is part of the reason why it is so hard to stamp out. It is apparently, according to all the studies, it is a dual causality relationship. Poverty apparently promotes corruption. How does poverty promote corruption? Absolutely, absolutely. My church, growing up, ran some orphanages in northern Mexico, and I'd go down to those orphanages in the church van, and one time we were stopped by a local Mexican policeman, No traffic violations. It was obvious we had been following all the rules. But he wouldn't let us go, and he told us we were going to have to go down to the station with him. And the driver of the van, I was in the passenger side seat, the driver of the van said, look, man, we're a church organization. We're just here to bring toys and food supplies to the kids in the orphanage. We're going to build them a playground. And the policeman said, you know, Christmas is coming. It's obvious he's trying to solicit a bribe from us. That's what he wanted. That's why he stopped us. And the driver of our church van, God bless him, he said, you know, man, we just don't do that. We're just here to help the kids. He let us go. Policeman let us go. We went on our way. You stand up to it, and those guys back down. But I thought to myself afterwards, you know, that poor policeman, he probably is underpaid. Probably his department intentionally pays him less than what they could do, so as to ensure that he will make it up elsewhere by soliciting bribes from the people who he stops on false charges. When you don't have enough to go around, corruption is often a very tempting thing. It is tempting to use your position as a government official or as any kind of a regulator for ill if you don't have enough and you need to make it up. So in fact, actually, apparently, according to the studies, the relationship is bribery leads to poverty and poverty leads to bribery. It makes it really hard to stamp out. It's so hard to stamp out that there are parts of the world where corruption is deeply entrenched and you cannot do business in those parts of the world unless you play the game that they play and you give and receive bribes the way they do. Let me pause and ask if there are any questions before I talk about one other aspect of this.
Can you just go over really quickly to the little document, like how one is consequential?
Sure. So this is consequential based wrongness. This is principle based wrongness. So the violation here is maybe a principle that we could posit, business ought to be fair. That's the principle that gets violated. Okay, and here it's character wrongness. Now I haven't put a character wrongness reason up here on the board yet, but we could certainly think of one very easily. Bribery is wrong because bribery damages the character states of the people who give and receive bribes. It corrupts them and leads them to engage in selfish, greedy, and malicious actions, which is harmful to them. We could say that that's the wrongness from the character state point of view. Good. Other questions before I offer another illustration up here? Yeah.
Which one of those three does the best in like a lose-lose situation? Like this law school of the two train tracks,
Mm-hmm.
where one's got a family member, the other one has 5 strangers. No, like that. I had that in my philosophy class.
Yeah, man. Yeah. I hear you. Yeah. So, can we cover that topic in a minute when I turn the video off? Is that okay? All right. There are some darker topics that I will cover momentarily. Okay. All right. Let us talk a little bit about why bribery is so hard to stamp out. Who took my eraser? Where did my eraser go? Is it down in front or anything? Can anybody see it? It's like somebody just filched it.
I don't have my glasses.
That's the sanitizer bottle.
On the floor. Is that like a... Oh, I thought that was...
This? You're way off. Okay. All right. I'm just going to do this. Okay. All right. So, in any bribing relationship, there's a giver and a receiver. giver pays money to the receiver and in return gets some sort of special goodie. Now, from a financial point of view, just speaking financially, both parties benefit, don't they? The giver benefits, he gets the contract. The receiver benefits, he gets the facilitation payment. Who doesn't benefit? Other businesses that didn't participate in it. Who else? Everybody else, right? Everybody in the society outside of that relationship loses. However, it is really hard to stamp out because both of these parties benefit financially. It is in their self-interest that the arrangement continue. Okay, this is kind of a problem is deeply studied in the literature, and it's usually called a tragedy of the commons problem. Tragedy of the commons problem. Circumstances in which some things are deeply self-interested, in the self-interest of the parties immediately in the circumstance that wrongness take place, and deeply opposed to the interests of the collective are called tragedy of the commons circumstances or problems. Think with me for just a minute. Have you ever noticed when you are stopped at the stoplights in Houston, once you get past the panhandlers, have you ever noticed how there's so much trash in the intersections? There's a lot of it. Or in the public parks. Like Herman Park inside the Loop. Whenever I go over there to the museums, it's always kind of trashed. I saw a dude the other day. He stopped in front of me at the stoplight, and he rolled down his window and just tossed a McDonald's bag out with one of those super size me gulp mugs that kind of spilled out onto the ground as he tossed it out. I was so ticked, I was going to go up there and make a citizen's arrest. Headbutt him through the window or something. My wife stopped me. She said, "He is bigger than you are. He is stronger than you are. He will beat you up." But apparently for this dude, it was too hard for him to wait until he stopped his car and came near a trash can again. It was too difficult. It would have taken 10 to 15 seconds of his life after all to walk to a trash can and dump his trash in. It's high cost. Much easier is just to throw it out the window. It was in his self-interest to just dump the trash. Just dump it out the window. Yet it was not in the interest of the collective that he do that. In common spaces, like traffic stoplights or like public parks, they tend to get more trashed because there is no particular group or party or owner in whose interest it is that those places be clean. It is in the collective interest that they be clean, but not in any individual's interest that they be cleaned. Okay, if you go and look at, say, retail centers, shopping centers, or stores, they're a lot cleaner. The reason why is because the owners make the employees go out and clean the trash from the parking lots or in the sidewalk in front of the business each day. It is in the self-interest of the owner of the store that the surroundings around the store be clean. But it's not really in anybody's immediate self-interest that the commons in parks and public intersections be clean. It is in the immediate self-interest of the giver and the receiver that the bribe take place. But it is in the interest of the collective that it not take place because of the reasons we mentioned. It leads to poverty, it undermines fairness, things like that. But because it is financially profitable for the giver, financially profitable for the receiver, bribery is really hard to stamp out. It continues. It goes on. Okay, it's a tragedy of the commons problem. Questions or comments on that? Just one other thing I want to say about this topic. does something become a bribe? When does a gift become a bribe? That's my view too. That's my view too. In business, there are bribes, and then there are civilities. And look, let's face it, business is more pleasant. It's more pleasant to do business when people are nice to each other, when they are civil to each other. And part of being civil to people is gifts or tokens of affection. Just something that suggests that you are happy to be doing business with somebody. Maybe that means picking up the tab at the restaurant. At what point does a civility, though, become a bribe? There are two different schools of thought here. Okay? Two different schools of thought on where the line is, at what point a civility becomes a bribe. One is a school of thought that focuses on numbers. Okay? And says it's a hard number where it becomes a bribe. And most businesses put that number around 500 or so. Sometimes it varies, 300 to 800. I've seen those numbers. But the business might have a regulation that says you can't give a gift to a counterparty that's more than $500. That's illegal for employees of our business. Okay? That's a pretty common school of thought, is to use a hard number. Another school of thought says it's based really at the point at which a civility becomes a bribe is based on influence and not on a number. So if a gift is intended to change the mind of the recipient about the business contract, then it is functioning as a bribe. Okay, even if it's $250, or maybe a civility could be $800, but not intended or received by the recipient as a mind-changing kind of a thing. Okay, on the influence view, what matters is inside the heads of the givers and receivers. That's what matters. Okay, but the problem with the influence view, although I think that this is probably the correct definition of when a civility becomes a bribe, the problem with the influence view is you can't get into people's heads and measure when exactly in their mind their decision changed, or whether it was intended to change the mind of the counterparty. So for the purposes of measurement, most businesses use the hard number approach. Although most people in theory would probably say that it is the influence definition that is the more precise definition of when a bribe is taking place. Questions or comments on that? Yes?
Would it be easy to see a change in pattern from some other factors or influence?
Contractor who previously denied service suddenly just becomes interested. Good point.
But like, what if the giver just wants to give, but the receiver takes a different way?
There is that problem too. Yeah. The giver could just be generous and just wants to say thank you for doing business or being willing to interact with me or something like that. And the receiver says, oh, I now change my mind about future contracts with this party. It's hard to measure that. Yeah. And for that reason, that's probably part of the reason why the hard number is usually used in business climates.